Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Holloway today. This is probably the polar opposite of my previous destination, that tourist hotspot that is Leicester Square. This is a part of London that tourists don't come to. I think it would be safe to say. And I was hoping for that reason that maybe there might be some hidden gems here. It is disputed, but the derivation for the name Holloway that I find most plausible is that it is a hollow way, as in a sunken lane, and it relates to an old droving route that came down from Highgate towards Smithfield Market. A small settlement grew up along the route, in fact two, Upper and Lower Holloway, and it seems likely that coaching inns would have been established, and we'll hopefully find an example of one of those later on. Pub number one, the Prince Edward. First question of interest is, who was it actually named after? There are a surprisingly large number of choices. The modern sign that we see today outside the pub seems to be of Prince Edward, the Black Prince. I think this pub probably dates to round about 1850, and it seems, given that date, it's possibly more likely this would have been named for Queen Victoria's father, who was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, and never himself, of course, ascended to the throne. The earliest newspaper mentions I could find of this pub, 1849, there is an article about parliamentary and financial reform. Going into the 1850s, there are a series of articles that are cricket related, and it seems at one time the pub had possibly just a very large garden, but it had some kind of grounds attached where cricket could be played. Fast forward a little bit to the 1890s, look at those Ordnance Survey maps of the area. You can see that the pub is clearly marked there on the corner, but by that time it looks like it probably had lost its cricket grounds. The pub is not really far from the former site of Holloway Prison, which has now been demolished. It was closed in, I believe, 2016. It was most famous as a women's prison. Inmates include many of the suffragettes, including Emmeline Pankhurst. So this pub is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. It's not a listed building though, so Historic England have not provided any commentary on it. I'm not sure what period these windows date to, but there are windows across the frontage bearing slogans like distinctive whiskies, wines and spirits. There's also quite a lot of brewery livery from Watney's still in place. You can see a couple of Watney Coombe Reed lanterns over one of the entrances, and in fact a whole sign across that entrance with the Watney name on it. Also over that entrance with the Watney Coombe Reed lanterns, some very attractive ironwork that still has the name of the pub Prince Edward in, although it's a little bit difficult to read today. On the interior is a partially glazed screen that has coloured yellow glass, and it's quite textured, it's not completely smooth. That apparently was imported from another pub in the 1960s to replace a former partition that had been removed. It does make for two very separate bar spaces today. You do in fact have to go out and go back in again to get from one side of the bar to the other. There is a 2-bay island bar back, and that fitting is apparently Victorian. It has etched glass panels. Above that there is more Watney's brewery livery. Probably the most intriguing feature are the pair of copper panels towards the back of the pub. These, we believe, date from that roughly 1900 most recent rebuild, and they are quite similar to copper panels that you may have also seen at the Blackfriar most famously, and perhaps less famously the Black Lion in Kilburn. It's tempting to believe they may actually be the work of the same artist, both some of that work at the Blackfriar and also the work at the Black Lion was a sculptor called Frederick T. Calcott. They depict two scenes. One is titled Prince Edward, A Call to Arms, and the other is titled Prince Edward at the Revels. Part of its charm may actually come from the 1960s refurbishment, in fact, and some of the seating is of that date. There's also a collection up high on the ceiling of old plates and other chinaware, also a carpet on the floor, definitely a very nostalgic, old-fashioned feel to this pub. It's worth mentioning that this is very much a locals pub, and on a weekday afternoon it was filled with geezers of a certain age watching the darts on the telly. It's the sort of place where, as a stranger, you're going to get a few curious stares from the regulars, and it might feel a bit like you're intruding. If you're not used to that kind of pub, you might not feel comfortable here. That said, the guy behind the bar, possibly the landlord, seemed like a nice bloke, and I spoke to one of the regulars who seemed happy to share some info on the pub. It's a real community pub, everyone seems to know everyone else, and it's the exact opposite of the sort of soulless chain pub you'll find in central London today. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I thought it was quite special. They don't serve any real ale either, I'm afraid, but if you don't mind Guinness, then the pint I had there was one of the best I've had in years. Pub number 2, the Coronet. Cheers from the Coronet. This is Timothy Taylor's landlord, £2.50 for a half. Many of you will be thinking this is a Wetherspoons conversion, and it was, but it ceased to be ran by Wetherspoons as of December 2023. And it was subsequently taken over by a property developer called David Nurani, who is continuing to run it as a pub. This, of course, was not always a pub. It began its life as the Savoy Cinema, built in 1940, later renamed the ABC Cinema in 1962, and then finally its tenure as a cinema ended with its being renamed to the Coronet in 1979. It finally closed as a cinema in 1983 after a brief spell as a snooker hall. Eventually in 1996 was bought by Wetherspoons and converted into the pub that we see today. While we're on the subject of grand, impressive cinema buildings in Holloway, it's interesting to note that just up the road from here is, I think, an even more impressive example of cinema building in the form of the Odeon, which dates to around the same time. That was built in 1937 to 1938 as the Gaumont Theatre, and that is a listed building, so there's quite a lot to read about it from Historic England. They summarise it as an example of transatlantic bravura. Back to the Coronet. The Cinema Treasures website, which is a great resource for learning about cinema history, they describe it as being in the modern Art Deco style, mostly a brick building, but part of the frontage is tiled. Today there is a large sign bearing the name of the cinema, the Coronet, but I think that has only been there since Wetherspoons took over and converted it to a pub. The neon around the frontage is also a later addition. Again, I think that only dates to Wetherspoons' takeover and conversion to a pub. Inside, I would say, as these cinema to pub conversions go, this is the one where I think you get the best sense of it still being the layout of a cinema. It still has a projector in the middle of the floor space. Whether or not that's original, I'm not sure, and you can see where the screen would have once been. There is a small projector screen there now. There are these large decorative grills that flank where the screen used to be on either side. They're quite an impressive feature, and above where the screen would have been there is something like, I'm not quite sure what the right architectural term for this is, it's a bit like a pelmet. It's a sort of curvy bit of moulded plasterwork that would presumably have been covering the top of the curtains at the time that the screen was still there. The balcony is still in place. I'm not sure that's in any way accessible today, and it has a row of old cinema prints, giant-sized cinema prints behind it to make it a bit more decorative. That would have been a very interesting space if that had been opened up for seating. So yes, obviously not a long-term historic pub, has only been a pub since the 1990s, as is the case with a lot of these Wetherspoons conversions, but I think it is a particularly nice example of one that, as I say, it still keeps the feel and the layout of that cinema interior, so you can really imagine how it was back in its heyday. Also an interesting example to see an ex-Wetherspoons pub. Pub number 3, the Enkel Arms. I'm reasonably sure this pub dates to at some point in the 1870s. The earliest newspaper record I could find for it was from 1877. That says that the pub is at that point brand new and was being offered up for sale. The freeholder and occupier was one Mr. Enkel, and it seems in an act of complete failure of humility, Robert Enkel in fact named this pub after himself. You can see the location of this pub marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map on the corner of Herzlet Road and Seven Sisters Road. Just round the corner from there, one street over, is an Enkel Street, and according to Streets with a Story, the local history publication about street naming in Islington, Enkel Street was named after Robert Enkel as well. Enkel Street no longer exists, but where that once was is now the Nag's Head shopping centre and Nag's Head market. And that's possibly an interesting aside because, as the name suggests, that was in fact named after a pub. There is still some remnant of that pub existing today. It's right at the corner of Holloway Road and Seven Sisters Road, and today it's some sort of slot machine type place, but it still has some of the original pub frontage, and in fact there are some wonderful old photos of the Nag's Head in its heyday when it was still functioning as a pub from around about 1900. So it's interesting that such a large swathe of this local area has been named after a pub, and yet the pub was not considered precious enough to preserve. It's not a listed building, the Enkel Arms, but it is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. There is on the corner a rendering of the coat of arms of the Enkel family. Roughly speaking, that seems to be two upward facing chevrons. I'm not sure if that's the correct heraldic term, with a lion above them. There is more granite at the ground floor level, and Ruth Siddall has actually visited here and identified that granite as imperial red granite. I think that's possibly of Swedish origin, although Ruth Siddall doesn't state in her text. And emerald pearl larvikite. There is still some quite attractive wrought ironwork bearing the phrase saloon bar over one of the entrances. I think one or two things might have changed since camera last visited here for their pub heritage site. The terrazzo floor seems to have disappeared, possibly just covered over by carpet. So I do suspect some more modern changes in at least one of those two vestibules, but at least one of them retains the tiles, which are of the Victorian era. Most notably though in the pub are two rare Victorian era partitions. One is a 3-bay partition, the other a 4-bay partition. Both of them now have doorways which possibly were cut into them at some point, not sure if that was the case. They have coloured glazed panels in them, which is a slightly unusual feature when we're used to seeing any remnants of these partitions in these Victorian pubs. They tend to be uncoloured etched glass. There's also a cutout in one of those partitions for a radiator, and I do wonder again if that's perhaps a modern change. A bit like the Prince Edward earlier, this is absolutely very much a locals pub, and again I think it's a sort of pub where perhaps a chance visitor might not absolutely feel at their most comfortable. Perhaps it's a little bit different later on in the evening when it gets a little bit busier. I was there sort of mid-afternoon, but I do think those partitions are quite interesting, quite unique. I'm afraid once again no hand pumps here, so it was just keg beers, and the Guinness was again decent. I think actually probably I slightly preferred it at the first pub, Prince Edward, but it was in pretty good shape here too, and a mere 5 pence more at £4.65. Pub number 4, the Owl and Hitchhiker. Doesn't open till 4 o'clock, but I thought I would do some of the talky bits sat outside the pub while I'm waiting for it to open. This, for most of its history, was known as the Half Moon, and indeed at the sort of parapet level on the frontage of the pub today you can still see the old name of the pub. It wasn't until the 21st century that it went through a spate of renaming. The earliest newspaper mention that I could find was from 1805, some sort of livestock sale. A useful reminder that not too long ago this part of London was still a farming area. A date of 1805 would already comfortably make this the oldest pub that we visited on today's tour. However, there are some records to suggest that some form of this pub may go back as far as the 1740s or possibly even earlier. Before we get there though, here is a quick look at the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. It looks as though there may have been a yard behind it, and that seems to be a first clue that at some point in its history this may have been a coaching inn. There is a publication from 1842, and in that it notes that this pub was at one time famed for cheesecakes, and it's this record that seems to give a dating of the pub to at least 100 years prior to that, and thus we get to the 1740s. This history of cheesecake selling is also mentioned in the ever useful Old and New London. They write, the Half Moon, a house especially celebrated, was once famous for its cheesecakes, which were sold in London by a man on horseback who shouted Holloway cheesecakes. I did a bit of digging around about what exactly a Holloway cheesecake comprises of, and found at least one source that cited a recipe of sorts, and that included such things as Madeira, cinnamon, nutmeg and currants. There is a beautiful engraving from possibly 1780, possibly 1800, I've seen different dates from different sources, of the York Common stage wagon, and that is actually driving along the Holloway, and in the background apparently the inn that you can see there is the Half Moon Inn here in Holloway. This is in fact the first building on today's pub itinerary that is a listed building by Historic England. The date suggested for the current building is around 1860. It's also on camera's Historic Pub Interiors site, and they suggest that some of the interior is late Victorian rather than 1860s. They call out things like the elaborately carved barback fitting. They mention that they're not completely convinced by Historic England's listing that the barback fitting has much engraved glass. They think that much of that is in fact more modern, and the original glass may have been lost. There are cast iron columns with Corinthian capitals holding up the ceiling. Camera's listing also makes note of the long bar counter, and think that may well be original, although possibly some work has been done on the top of that counter. Good vestibules to be found on the front left and to the right, but all of that glazing looks modern. I think one of the entrances today looks very much like a former archway which possibly coaches could have travelled through at the point in history when this was still a functioning coaching inn, which I'm fairly sure would have been the case. Pub is now open. Timothy Taylor's landlord on tap. I'm not sure if the camera listing for the interior really prepares you for what's inside, because it's a really sort of weird mixed bag. There is a wonderful tradition of pubs with knickknacks hanging from the ceilings. Usually those knickknacks, by the time we get to see them, are old. In this case we have a pub that has been adorned with quite modern knickknacks. There is a collection of hairdryers hanging up from the ceiling. Nobody seems to know why. There is a piano on a diagonal angle by the side of one set of stairs. There is a Sinclair C5. Who remembers those hanging vertically on one of the walls? All sorts of weird ephemera and artifacts. That may not be to everyone's taste. If you want a sort of pure, genuine Victorian pub interior, there are certainly some elements of Victorian pub interior here, but there is also a lot of modern stuff, and I completely understand that may put some people off. I actually found it weirdly charming. It was nuts. Certainly quite different from two of the pubs we saw earlier, the Enkel Arms and the Prince Edward. I think this is probably a bit more aimed at young people. They have DJ nights and comedy nights and that sort of thing, so it's quite a different crowd, I imagine, here in the evening. Here from in front of the rather splendid looking, I think, Odeon Cinema on Holloway Road. It's time to sign off. That's been a slightly unusual video, hasn't it? I'll admit. Not sure many of you will be queuing up to rush to Holloway to visit its pubs, but I do think there are some interesting quirky corners like this in London. The fact that there aren't so many tourists mean that some of the pubs have just been left alone to do their own thing, and I think they've developed some quite interesting character. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.